Hello everyone and welcome back to Political Economy Week 7. This is the second week on inequality and redistribution. And remember, when we talked about sort of models of redistribution last week, we encountered the Meltzer-Richard model, which was basically this idea that the median voter decides, and if the median voter is relatively poor, they're going to redistribute a lot. They're going to want a lot of taxation and redistribution. And if the median voter is richer, then they will want less of this. But we also saw that the implications of this model, so the relationship between sort of greater inequality and greater levels of redistribution, doesn't really hold in the data. So today we will look at a couple other mechanisms that perhaps explain sort of what determines redistribution cross-nationally or in democracies more generally. And we'll do basically three things. So we'll walk through some of these mechanisms. Then I'll provide a sort of a quick data-based sort of analysis for one of these mechanisms, and then in the end I will pick up on some of the comments from the seminars where we discussed a lot of things are relating to sort of where these preferences for redistribution come from, how perceptions of inequality are formed, etc. And I'll flag up some interesting papers that relate to these questions in the end. So let's get started. So like I said, last week was basically focused a lot on sort of the basic idea of like, if we have democracy, why don't we see a lot of redistribution? Because, the majority of the people is poor and the median voter might sort of rationally want to redistribute quite a bit. But we've seen that that's not the case. So one of the alternative theories, of course, is that real political systems are more complicated. So, the median voter doesn't set the tax rate, the median voter votes for a party. And there's a strong finding that, of course, having left parties in government drives redistribution. But that's almost a bit tautological. Parties favoring redistribution are left parties. So parties favoring redistribution actually do redistribution. That seems a very proximate explanation, to put it sort of generously. So it's not particularly surprising that this is the case. So the immediate question that this raises then is, of course, okay, so where do the left parties come from? And what we'll see towards the end of this first video today is an interesting sort of theoretical mechanism set out by Torben Iversen and David Soskies that basically explains how proportional representation, so the electoral system, might be linked to a predominance of left or right parties in government. But since we're talking about PR system, proportional representation, and sort of electoral system, we might think of other mechanisms that then link to redistribution. Another sort of immediate consequence, obviously, of having a proportional representation system are that there are more parties and therefore more frequent coalition governments, as we know from most European countries. And there could be a link between coalition governments and redistribution. And there's also sort of a more direct effect, perhaps, in the sense that we can think about sort of the incentives that politicians have, who to please, who to target spending to, or how narrow and targeted spending can be really in majoritarian versus proportional representation systems. So we'll go through these three mechanisms in turn, sort of in reverse order if you want, and then provide an empirical test. When we talked about social choice type problems, we talked already a lot about electoral systems and different voting methods. So this shouldn't come as a big surprise, but there are, of course, different ways to elect representatives in democracies. And one of the sort of key theoretical distinctions is between more majoritarian electoral systems and more proportional electoral systems. And all of you are familiar with the basic idea of proportional representation type systems, or majoritarian, for example, single member district plurality system like first past the post in the UK. So classic example of majoritarian system is the UK Parliament, where in sort of geographic constituencies, whoever wins a plurality of the votes is elected. Historically, this is, of course, easy to administer, and this is sort of the older type of electoral system, if you want. And one of the sort of normative, perhaps, advantages is, of course, that you have your own MP who you can hold accountable. So perhaps you can sort of when we talked about accountability and performance a little bit, perhaps you can make, hold them to account and sort of induce good performance. On the other end of the spectrum, if you want, we have proportional representation systems. Of course, real electoral systems are complicated, but the basic idea is, and there's different variations of PR systems, but the basic idea is that there are multi-member districts. So there's larger districts, these are sometimes sort of state-sized, or they are the whole country, like in the Netherlands. And then there's some mechanism applied that basically translates the proportion of share of votes that a party won into a proportion of seats in the parliament, because parliament is of course smaller than the population as a whole. And the best example of a sort of pure PR type system is the Netherlands, where there are 150 seats in parliament, and basically these are translated straight from the sort of vote share that parties get, is translated straight into seat shares. Sort of from a normative point of view, perhaps the more, the advantage is that there's a more accurate representation of different interests. We talked a lot about aggregation of preferences and about misrepresentation and about strategic voting already. Obviously, in a PR system, you can sort of more directly express your preferences, and the decision making for what kind of policy gets implemented happens further downstream, for example, in coalition negotiations. So if we think about electoral systems, we can often think of sort of a continuum between a sort of traditional majoritarian system with single member district plurality, like in the UK or US House of Representatives, and on the one hand, and sort of a pure sort of proportional representation system like the Netherlands on the other hand. So what are the consequences of these electoral systems? Well, one of the most famous sort of findings, I guess, in political science is what is called Duverger's law. People thought it was so important that they called it a law, like a universal law of nature, physics or something. It doesn't quite work out that well. So according to Duverger's law, the UK should have two parties, but it doesn't really, right? So like, let's think about this a little bit. So basically, the core idea is the following. Society is complicated. There are social divisions, cleavages in the terminology. And these cleavages are basically the primary driving force behind the formation of parties. So if you have an economic cleavage, the one we have been talking about this week and several other weeks, sort of from left to right, from sort of favoring more redistribution to sort of not wanting any taxation and redistribution. If this economic cleavage is there, there's maybe demand for parties on both sides of this type of spectrum. On the other hand, if you add other cleavages like a liberal authoritarian sort of dimension that we talked about, or perhaps a religious cleavage where some part of the country is sort of Protestant and another part is Catholic, or a agrarian sort of rural versus urban kind of cleavage. So there can be many types of cleavages, of course. The one we are most interested in, of course, for this class and for these types of models, when we talk about inequality and redistribution, is the economic cleavage. But in general, the number of these cleavages, ethnic cleavages are another big example, of course. The number of these cleavages basically creates a demand for the formation of parties. But the electoral institutions, like the electoral rule, like PR versus majoritarian, basically acts as a brake on the formation of these parties. If you have a lot of cleavages, religious, ethnic, economic divides, rural divides, and a PR system, you'll get many parties. But if you have a majoritarian system, then this acts as a sort of constraint on the number of parties that can, plausibly win an election in a constituency. So basically, we have our old sort of model of preferences, cleavages in society, sort of interacting with the rules of the game, the institutions, the electoral rule in this case, producing some outcome, the number of parties in this case. That's the core of Duverger's law. How exactly does it work? There are basically two mechanisms to be aware of: the mechanical effect and the strategic effect of Duverger's law. So what's the mechanical effect? Well, the mechanical effect is basically this disproportionality in the translation of vote shares into seat shares. I have here on the slide a distribution of votes for various parties in the 2015 UK general elections. And we have the vote shares that these parties got, and we got the seat shares on the right hand. And if you look at the vote shares, you see that the Labour Party got about 30% of the vote, Conservative Party 37%, UKIP got 13% at the time of the vote, and the Liberal Democrats 8% at the time. But these vote shares, winning 13% of the vote is no mean feat for UKIP. Huh? This is a good performance for a sort of radical right party, I would think. Huh? And in most proportional representation type systems, this would guarantee you a sizable sort of faction in parliament. But not so in the UK, not so in a majoritarian system. If we look at the seat shares in the Westminster Parliament on the right, we see that the Conservatives got more than 50% of the seats, the Labour Party got 35% of the seats, and UKIP got 0 seats. UKIP had 1 seat for a while from a guy who basically defected, but they won exactly 0 seats in a general election. And this is not some sort of magical thing. It is just what happens if you have a single member district plurality system where winning 13% or 20% or 30% in a seat doesn't really guarantee you winning the seat. Huh? Only the sort of largest parties are able to actually win constituencies. So there's a mechanical effect of this electoral rule. That is simply a mechanism of, like, you vote for this party, but if this party, even if a large chunk of the voters, 13% is a large chunk of the electorate, votes for a party, that doesn't guarantee representation in parliament if the party is unable to win specific constituencies. And this is probably quite sad for small parties like the Liberal Democrats or UKIP at the time, who represent a large chunk of the population, who were able to convince voters to vote for them, but in the end found no representation in parliament. But if you look closely at the chart I just presented, there was one party that only won about 5% of the vote, but got a much more sizable representation in parliament. And that's, of course, the Scottish National Party, the SNP. And the SNP actually is able to win. So in the 2019 most recent election I have here, I should have looked it up for the 2015 election. In the most recent election, actually was able to win 48 seats in parliament, despite having a relatively small percentage of the votes. And the reason for this is that the support is geographically concentrated. So you shouldn't take Duverger's law as something saying something about necessarily the sort of national party system, but it is about sort of local or regional party systems in the end. It is a constituency level theory. Only the biggest party at the constituency level have a chance to be represented. So in the case of the SNP, they are able to have all their support basically concentrated in Scotland, obviously, and as a consequence are able to win Westminster seats. And the same is true, for example, for Plaid Cymru. But also it used to be a thing that the Lib Dems basically had a concentrated sort of support base in the I think in the sort of southwest of Britain. So if you can concentrate your support in geographic constituencies, then you can, even as a small party, succeed in majoritarian systems. But the mechanical effect, more broadly, of course, is a brutal sort of constraint on representation in a majoritarian system, and basically leads to fewer parties being represented at the national level. But electoral rules not only have a mechanical effect, they also have a strategic or psychological effect, if you want. The fact that the translation of vote shares into seat shares works the way it does, and that we have just seen, means that people, of course, are aware of this. People are not stupid. They can engage in strategic voting. So if you think that, I don't know, a conservative candidate doesn't really have a chance, maybe you vote for the Lib Dem instead. Or if you think that the Lib Dem candidate is your preferred choice and they don't have a chance, you vote for the Labour Party. Or if you really want to vote for the Greens but they don't have a chance, you maybe vote for the Labour Party. So people vote for parties that they think have a realistic chance of winning in a specific constituency. And a consequence of these sort of strategic considerations is basically that new parties, for example, have a very strong, a very difficult sort of stand. Who remembers these guys on the right? Does anyone remember these guys? This is the Independent Group for Change, the Tiggers, and they ran in the UK election a few elections ago. Basically as a consequence of the sort of Brexit impasse and the Labour Party sort of moving towards a more pro-Brexit position, they basically said, no, we are sort of pro-European, some Conservatives, some Labour Party supporters, and we make our own party. And that's a great idea, and that might have worked very well in a proportional representation system. They had a relatively popular leader, Chuka Umunna, former Labour Party politician, and several very high-profile, sort of constantly in the media type politicians. And in a PR system, these would have been a formidable sort of new party. But in a majoritarian systems, these guys just got swept away. So they all lost their seats immediately, basically, and the party is gone. So the fact that they don't really have a chance in winning, both because of the mechanical effect and because people are sort of afraid to waste their vote, means that they don't really never really had a chance. But it also throws up another interesting question. So the strategic effect works on the side of the voter, but it also works on the side of the politicians. So if you are an aspiring politician in the UK, you want to change the world for the better. And we already talked a little bit when we talked about the dictator's handbook. I'm not sure how successful you're going to be unless you do certain things that then make you perhaps not achieve those aims. But if you have these aspirations in a first past the post sort of single member district priority system, what are you going to do? Are you going to start your own party like you would in the Netherlands, where sort of every public character can start his own or her own party? No, you wouldn't do this. So this is the independent group is a strong, great example for complete failure of trying to sort of overthrow the party system in this kind of electoral system. You wouldn't do this. You would, of course, if you're strategic, you would, of course, do what all of these guys used to do before they sort of were chased out of their parties, perhaps a little bit because of their sort of remain positions. And join one of the existing sort of larger parties. If you want to make change, if you want to affect policy outcomes in the UK, you have to be a member of the Labour Party or Conservative Party. Those are the two sort of routes to power, if you want, and to affect change directly if you are an aspiring politician, or Democrats and Republicans in the US case. Maybe you can affect policy, of course, by making another party strong that sort of exerts pressure at these parties. So perhaps the Green Party has some success in that respect, and perhaps UKIP had strong success. The fear of being sort of attacked from the right, of course, has in part motivated the sort of conservative parties move toward Brexit and sort of a more authoritarian type positions, perhaps. But basically the takeaway point here is that both voters and politicians are strategic in which kind of parties they coordinate on, and there's only really space for two big national parties in a first past the post single member district plurality system, unless you have sort of regional cleavages. So what are the consequences of these sort of mechanisms, the strong effect of electoral rule, Duverger's law if you want? What are the consequences of these sort of electoral rule induced mechanisms on redistribution, on government size, on reduction in inequality? We'll look at basically three types of mechanisms. They're sort of in reverse order from the first slide. The first one we'll think about is coalitions. Now, obviously, electoral system has a strong effect on the number of parties represented in parliament. And if there are more parties, then it is less likely to have a sort of single party majority government, of course. As a consequence, there are going to be more coalition governments. So far, so good. But what do coalitions do? Well, coalitions have to, in a way, pay off different different groups, different constituencies. If you form a coalition between a Labour Party and a Green Party, a Social Democratic Party and a Green Party, like it used to be sometimes in Germany, then you have to not only fund the policies that the Social Democratic Party wants, but you also have to fund policies that the Green Party wants and sort of pay off, if you want, the Green Party voters. Or if you form a coalition between sort of a Social Democratic Party and an agrarian sort of farmers type party, then you not only need to sort of redistribute to the urban poor perhaps, or to unemployed people, but also to the farmers. So you can think of sort of basically the coalition mechanism itself inducing greater sort of redistributive spending, because wider parts of the population sort of need to be paid off, need to be included in the coalition that benefits from the government. And if you look at the Persson and Tabellini paper, that's one of the mechanisms that is discussed there. But there's also a more direct, perhaps, sort of effect of the electoral system on politicians' induced preferences. And that kind of does away with parties and coalitions. What we can ask ourselves is basically, who should these politicians try to please in these different systems? Who are the ones that they need to keep happy? Thinking back to sort of this idea of selectorate theory and sort of dictator's handbook. So who these individual members of parliament, that form a government together, who do they need to keep happy? Who do they have to funnel money to? Well, in a single member district plurality system, it is clearly the specific constituencies that they have won. Either all the constituencies that they have won, or perhaps sort of either their core sort of constituencies, or perhaps marginal constituencies that they need to keep on board for the next election. And there's a reason, things like the what is it called, the Fund for Towns or something, that has been set up now, that sort of tries to target spending into specific sort of northern, newly conservative voting seats, has been set up in the way it has been set up. This is targeted spending, to support specific sort of regional constituencies. So politicians in a single member district plurality system, in other words, engage what the American politics people call pork barrel spending, because you bring this barrel of pork, apparently, I don't know, it's some weird 19th century American term, barrel of pork, of goodies home to your district, basically, so that's the way to be re-elected in American politics and to some extent in UK politics as well. Contrast this with proportional representation systems. Who are MPs to please? Who should parties please in a proportional representation system? Well, they can't engage in this kind of super targeted spending. They have to engage in universal spending. They have to engage in programs that benefit sort of wider, group-based perhaps constituencies, or sort of more wider societal coalition type constituencies, rather than narrow targeted geographic constituencies. So as a consequence, politicians under proportional representation will have to vote for more encompassing kind of programs, broader social spending, more universal type programs that benefit a larger social constituency. How could you test this? There's a very clever paper that's in the readings that is by Stratmann and Bauern. Basically what they do is they show that in the German electoral system, where they are legislators with the PR type incentives, universal incentives, and they are legislators, of course, with a sort of single member district plurality incentive, with a specific constituency. And they show nicely that these politicians are not stupid. These politicians, of course, select into the types of committees like agriculture that allow them to funnel funding to their specific constituency. So politicians that are elected under single member district plurality self-select into these committees that let them create the pork barrel spending that they need in order to get re-elected, versus the PR politicians having not selecting into these committees, selecting into more universal committees. And this kind of distinction between these two types of electoral systems and their direct consequences on politicians' sort of induced preferences is the mechanism that Persson and Tabellini put forward in their paper. And if you read through the paper, you can see that this is actually follows very nicely sort of the research design structure that we've seen before. So they have a very clearly defined research question. What's the relationship between sort of institutions? They ask a slightly wider question, right? But in our case, electoral system and sort of economic policy type outcomes, redistribution, if you want. And they have a theory that I just sort of elaborated on single-member district priority leading to narrowly targeted programs to benefit small geographically determined constituencies. And while PR leads to sort of spending on broader social groups, more spending overall, of course. So they then have a sort of clearly defined hypothesis. Countries with PR systems have higher government spending than countries with majoritarian systems, okay? And then what do? Well, they have sort of a research design that basically looks at cross-national data, the study of democracies only. Of course, this doesn't work quite that way in dictatorships because there's no, elections or no working elections, effective elections. And so how do they measure it? Well, so we can think about measurement then. So their cases are, or observations are, these sort of cross-national study. Their independent variable, what's that? Well, it's the classification of countries into either proportional representation or SMDP type systems. Or you could use something more continuous, like a measure of proportionality. How proportional or disproportional is an electoral system? For example, by looking at the relationship between vote shares and seat shares. And their outcome is spending as a percentage of GDP, same as we've seen last week. And if you look at the paper, you see that they find some support for their theory. The third mechanism that links the electoral rule, PR versus majoritarian, to redistributive outcomes, government spending, for example, is Everson and Soskai's paper. And basically what they do is they start from the premise that the main sort of effect of the electoral rule is via the proportion of left or right governments that get elected. So why would the electoral rule favor different types of governments? Well, the data is right here in table 1. If you have a look, you can see that by electoral system, proportional or majoritarian, you can see that proportional representation systems much more frequently feature left governments than majoritarian systems. So you can see in the table that only about 26% of these countries that they looked at, 1945 to 98, so it's quite dated already, but for this sort of time period, for the countries that they look at, only about a quarter of the time government of the right is in power, whereas for majoritarian systems, for 3/4 of the time in majoritarian system, right party government is in power. So that's quite a striking difference, sort of empirically. And the reason, the way they explain this is basically as follows. So, in a proportional representation system, there's space for multiple parties. If there are 3 groups in society, the poor, the middle class, and the rich, then there's basically room for 3 parties: a sort of leftist, sort of socialist party, a middle class party, and a party for the rich, for the upper class, and these will be voted for, and as a consequence, you will often see basically coalitions between the sort of left and middle party as an outcome. But what about a majoritarian system? Majoritarian system is more complicated because people can't just vote for their class, because there's no space for 3 parties in this type of system. There's only space for 2 parties if you want. So the median voter basically faces an interesting choice. The choice for the leftists, for the poor people, is easier. They vote for the Labour Party, for the left party. And the choice for the rich people is also easy. They vote for the right party. But the choice for the median voter is not so simple. For the middle class, they can choose to vote with either party. But of course, in either party, they might be, if they are split in a way between these 2 parties, then they're going to be in a minority in both of these parties. So there's going to be more poor people than middle class people in the Labour Party, and there's going to be more rich people than middle class people in the right-wing party. That's a problem. Why is that a problem? Well, because the party leadership can ultimately not credibly commit. If the party is mostly consistent of sort of poor people, of true leftist party supporters. So if they are in a party, in a leftist party, say, with a majority sort of poor people support, then the leadership of the party might decide to implement sort of very leftist policies that are maybe not in the interest of the middle class. On the other hand, if they vote with the sort of right-wing party, then they also might end up with a situation where they basically implement policies that are good for the rich and not so good for the middle class or for poor people. But if you think about sort of the interests of the middle class, then the sort of outcome where they vote with the right-wing party that benefits the rich people more, so low taxes, fewer social benefits, on average is for them probably sort of better than voting with a sort of leftist party that might institute high tax and high redistribution kind of outcome that doesn't really include the middle class, where the middle class shoulders a lot of the burden but doesn't really get that much of the benefit. So this kind of asymmetry between these two possible sort of outcomes, if the party leaderships sort of revert to type, are the problems that the middle class, the median voter, if you want, in this scenario, faces, and as a consequence prefers voting with the right-wing party in majoritarian systems. So these basically give us three different mechanisms that explain how electoral rules are linked to redistributive policy outcomes. But before we move on to our analysis, I have one more question. Our sort of standing motto in this class has been that there's always a bigger game. And if proportional representation leads to more leftist governments and coalition governments and more spending and these kind of things, then politicians should, of course, know this. So why do they choose proportional representation or move from the older sort of single-member district priority system to proportional representation type systems? And that's actually one of the big sort of questions in one big question in political science is the question of the origin of these electoral institutions. And one of these papers by Karl Bosch is in the readings, and there's some point in the Everson and Soskai's piece as well. But basically, the story is something around sort of protecting your losing share in the political process, as the parties on the left rises. So some insurance type story from the right wing parties that were in power, and politicians that were in power at the time. But basically this question about the origin of institutions, of course, is always the big one.